It is the winter of 1609. Inside the walls of James Fort, Virginia, 140 men, women, and children are waiting to die. Not from arrows, not from a frontal assault, from hunger. Outside those walls, the most powerful native leader on the eastern seaboard, a man the English called Powhatan, has cut off every trade route, every hunting ground, every source of food within reach. He does not need to attack. He just needs to wait, and he knows it. By the time spring arrives, only 60 colonists are still breathing. The others perished in the cold and the dark, reduced to eating snakes, rats, cats, horses, and, according to the accounts that survived, possibly one another. One soldier was reportedly executed for consuming his own wife. History calls this season the starving time, and it is one of the most harrowing chapters in early American history. But here is the part that never makes it into the textbooks. This catastrophe was not an accident. It was engineered. Powhatan, the paramount chief of a confederacy spanning 30-some nations and nearly 14,000 people, had seen this moment coming years before it arrived. He had studied the English, tested their weapons, manipulated their leaders, and when the time was right, he tightened the grip and waited for James Fort to collapse. So how did it come to this? And more importantly, why did it not work? To Frontier, Uncensored. I am your host, Dustin, and today we are diving into the full story of the First Anglo-Powhatan War, the brutal, complicated, and largely forgotten conflict that determined whether England would have a foothold in North America at all. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button, because this is the kind of history that changes how you see everything else. Let us get into it. To understand this war, you have to understand the man at the center of it. Powhatan was not simply a tribal chief. He was the architect of a regional empire. By the time English ships appeared on the James River in 1607, he had consolidated dozens of Algonquian-speaking nations under his authority through a combination of strategic marriages, military conquest, and tribute systems that rivaled anything the Spanish had built in Central America. His real name was Wahunsanaka. The English named him after his home village, and the name stuck. He was, by the time of Jamestown's founding, an elderly man in his 60s, but his mind was razor-sharp, and his reach was enormous. And when those 3 English ships anchored on the James River in May of 1607, his first instinct was not to destroy them. It was to understand them. He had reasons for caution that had nothing to do with the English. His most dangerous rivals were the Monacans, a non-Algonquian-speaking people who lived beyond the fall line to the west. The English, with their thundering firearms, could be an asset against enemies like that, or they could be made into subordinate allies, absorbed into the Powhatan Confederacy, the way dozens of smaller nations had been. That was the game Powhatan was playing in the early days, and for a while, the English had no idea. Here is something that almost no one talks about. The site the English chose for Jamestown was not selected because it was defensible against native people. It was chosen to protect against the Spanish. The colonists feared a Spanish naval attack from the sea. They were far less concerned about the thousands of Algonquian warriors surrounding them on all sides, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how badly they misread the situation. Powhatan's opening moves were subtle and calculated. While he arranged for a group of English explorers to be invited to a feast, he simultaneously ordered a test attack on the men left behind at Jamestown. The reason was straightforward. He wanted to know what those muskets could actually do in a fight. Gabriel Archer, one of the colonists, noted that the Powhatan warriors learned quickly not to approach within musket range. Meanwhile, the English learned to fear ambush from the tall grass and the tree line. Both sides were studying each other. Then Powhatan pulled a move, so smooth, it deserves its own chapter. After ordering the attack himself, he told the colonists he had not authorized it. He offered his protection. In one stroke, he cast himself as their guardian and left the English genuinely uncertain whether they were dealing with a friend or an enemy. Captain George Percy called him the subtle old fox, and that single nickname captures an entire diplomatic philosophy. The moment that would define the mythology of early Virginia came in December of 1607. A communal hunting party, led by Powhatan's younger brother Opechancanough, captured John Smith and eventually brought him before Powhatan himself at Werowocomoco on the York River. What happened next has been retold so many times that the legend has almost swallowed the history. Pocahontas, Powhatan's young daughter, allegedly threw herself over John Smith's body to save his life. For centuries, that scene dominated the story. But most historians today believe what actually happened was something far more interesting than a rescue. They believe Smith underwent a formal adoption ceremony, a ritual through which Powhatan was attempting to bring the English leader into the Confederacy as a subordinate chief, a werowance, bound by loyalty and tribute. Smith would have had a specific village, Capahossack, near the capital. He would have been useful and controllable. Smith declined. He pledged allegiance to the English king instead, and that refusal, more than anything else, set the two civilizations on a collision course. Now here is the detail that stays with me. In September of 1608, Smith and Captain Christopher Newport attempted to crown Powhatan with a copper crown and declare him a subject of the English king. Powhatan accepted the gifts, but barely bent his knee for the ceremony, later refusing to kneel at all, and then he cut off trade with Jamestown entirely. He had been offered subordination. Both sides had refused. What came next was probably inevitable. The land itself became a weapon before either side truly went to war. Historians have documented that the English arrived at the beginning of one of the worst droughts in nearly 8 centuries. From 1606 to 1612, the Tidewater region of Virginia experienced the driest 7-year stretch in 770 years, with exceptionally brutal winters layered on top. Corn, which the Powhatan Confederacy relied on as the central crop of civilization, was at an absolute premium. The colonists had arrived woefully unprepared, and to be honest, disinclined to feed themselves. They had come expecting to find gold, to manage a trading empire, to live the way the Spanish had in Mexico. Instead, they found swamp, mosquitoes, and a drought that was killing everyone, regardless of which side of the palisade walls you lived on. Powhatan's gifts of food, offered strategically in those early years, literally kept Jamestown alive. Smith supplemented those gifts through aggressive bargaining and, increasingly, through outright theft. When Powhatan finally shut down trade in 1609, the English position became critical almost overnight. Then came the catastrophe that broke whatever fragile order remained. A massive fleet of resupply ships was dispatched from England, but the flagship, the Sea Venture, vanished in a storm off the coast of Bermuda. The ship carried the colony's new leadership. Without it, James Fort dissolved into political chaos. Smith, already wounded and beset by critics, was left managing a collapsing settlement with depleting food and no clear command structure. He sent soldiers out in 2 directions to relieve the strain. Downriver, one group attacked a Paspahegh settlement, burned temples, and desecrated the tombs of native leaders. Upriver, another group under Francis West attempted to seize a village of symbolic importance to the Powhatan Confederacy itself. Both expeditions descended into fighting. Both lost roughly half their men. The war had begun before anyone formally declared it. Smith left Virginia in October of 1609, and the situation unraveled fast. Young Henry Spelman, a 14-year-old English boy who had been living among Powhatan's people as a kind of informal hostage and liaison, arrived at Jamestown with an invitation. Powhatan wanted the English to come visit him at his new capital at Orapax. He said there would be corn. Captain John Ratcliffe led a group of roughly 50 men into Powhatan's territory. They walked directly into one of the most devastating ambushes of the early colonial period. About 33 men perished, 2/3 of the party. Ratcliffe himself was captured. What happened to him afterward was described by witnesses as something they could barely commit to paper. The women of the village reportedly used mussel shells to carry out a prolonged execution. Spelman, who witnessed the scene, fled and went to live among the Petawamek, a nation on the margins of Powhatan's Confederacy. After that, all but a handful of colonists retreated inside James Fort. Powhatan ordered his warriors to cut off every trade route, block access to the surrounding forests, and halt any hunting beyond the walls. He understood the English weakness. He did not need to storm their palisades. He would let famine do what arrows could not, and it very nearly worked. 140 people entered that winter inside Fort James. 60 emerged the following spring. Those numbers are worth sitting with for a moment. More than half of every man, woman, and child inside those walls perished over the course of a few months, reduced in the accounts of survivors to a state of desperation that the colonial chronicler William Strachey said was more than he had the heart to fully describe. Strachey was not a man given to understatement. Here is what you might be asking yourself right now. If Powhatan had the English this completely trapped, if famine was doing exactly what he needed it to do, why did he not press the advantage? Why did he not simply order the final assault that would have ended Jamestown permanently? That answer is coming. But first, something unexpected pulled the English back from the edge. The Sea Venture, that lost flagship, had not sunk. It had been wrecked on the coast of Bermuda, where the passengers and crew spent 10 months building 2 smaller vessels from local timber before sailing them to Virginia. They arrived at James Fort on May 24, 1610. Among the survivors was William Strachey, whose account of the shipwreck would later inspire Shakespeare to write The Tempest. But the emotional charge of their arrival quickly gave way to reality. The fort was a graveyard. The new acting governor, Thomas Gates, made the call to abandon Virginia entirely. The colonists boarded ships and began sailing down the James River toward the open sea, toward England, toward the end of the colonial experiment. They never made it. Coming upriver was another ship. On board was the newly appointed governor of Virginia, Thomas West, the 3rd Baron De La Warr, along with a year's worth of supplies and a fresh mandate from the Virginia Company of London. Gates turned his ships around. The English were staying, and this time, they were not interested in negotiation. De La Warr and his Lieutenant Governor Gates had come with explicit instructions. Capture Powhatan. Neutralize his religious leaders, the Queofcosucks, whom the colonists believed had advised him to destroy the earlier Roanoke colonists. Redirect the annual tribute of Powhatan's vassal chiefdoms to the English crown, and educate every native child, especially every native child, in English customs and Christianity. To enforce this agenda, Gates imposed a legal code on the colony called the Laws Divine, Moral and Martial, later edited and published in 1612. The rules were severe enough to provoke condemnation even in England. A soldier accused of stealing food, for example, was bound to a tree until he perished from exposure. But the code brought discipline to a settlement that had been near collapse, and it gave the English military the structure they needed to go on offense. On July 9, 1610, they did exactly that. The first major English counterattack was launched against the Cocotan people near the mouth of the James River. An English drummer used a traditional Powhatan greeting rhythm to lure warriors to the riverbank. When they approached, the English struck. The accounts left by George Percy describe the carnage in terms of scale, not names. Bodies in the grass, a settlement burned, fields seized. Not long after, a force under Percy attacked the Paspahegh people, whose territory encompassed Jamestown itself. 16 people perished. Their chief's wife and young children were taken prisoner. What happened next is one of the most disturbing moments in the entire colonial record. Percy wrote that his soldiers muttered among themselves because the children had been spared, when other captives had not been. A council was called. A decision was made. The children were thrown from the boat into the river and shot as they struggled in the water. The woman who was their mother was executed shortly after by one of the commanders. Do you think, looking at that moment, that either side still believed they were in a conventional war? Let us know in the comments, because this is the exact point where something fundamental in how both civilizations approached this conflict. The English had brought to Virginia the tactics of the Irish Wars, where colonial forces under Elizabeth I had pioneered a form of warfare built on total destruction, burning villages, seizing harvests, targeting civilians regardless of age or gender. These were methods refined in another colonial theater and imported to the Chesapeake almost wholesale. The Powhatan Confederacy, for all the genuine violence of its own warfare traditions, had built certain restraints into its method of conflict. Prisoners were valuable, as symbols of victory, as potential adoptees, as bargaining chips. Women and children were typically spared. Violence was usually connected to specific grievances, specific raids, specific avenging of slights. Unlimited, indiscriminate destruction was not part of the framework. That framework was now collapsing on both sides. Through 1610 and 1611, the war swung back and forth. An English expedition of 200 men moved upriver toward the falls of the James and was initially defeated by Achimekes, a female chief, whose warriors drove the colonists back before the English eventually returned and ravaged her village. William West, the governor's nephew, perished in the fighting. Nopunk, a Paspahegh leader, perished in separate engagements. Then, in March of 1611, with the deputy governor absent and a power vacuum briefly opened, hundreds of Powhatan warriors struck the Jamestown blockhouse. Percy described the arrows as thick as hail. The entire garrison of 20 men perished. But then, crucially, the warriors pulled back. They would not risk a full assault on James Fort itself. It was the second time Powhatan had stopped short of a killing blow, and it was almost certainly the second time that restraint cost him the war. Sir Thomas Dale arrived in May of 1611 and became arguably the most consequential figure of the entire conflict. A disciplinarian of genuine ferocity, Dale expanded the legal code to its harshest form and immediately began a strategic offensive. In June, he led 100 armored soldiers against the Nansemond people at the mouth of the James, burning their towns. In September, reinforced by a new shipload of soldiers, he drove upriver and established the settlement of Henricus, a fortified town deep in Powhatan territory. Dale now had the Powhatan heartland pinched between English pressure from both ends of the river and the Monacan people beyond the falls to the west. For nearly 2 years, the elderly Powhatan could do almost nothing. English plantations spread along the James, despite scattered resistance. Powhatan's authority visibly weakened. His confederacy had not fractured, but it was under pressure from every direction. And then came the event that changed everything. Not a battle, a kidnapping. Captain Samuel Argall had been exploring the northern reaches of the Chesapeake, building trade relationships with peoples on the margins of Powhatan's confederacy, particularly the Potawatomi. In April of 1613, Argall received remarkable intelligence. Pocahontas, Powhatan's daughter, the same young woman who had allegedly intervened for John Smith years earlier, was staying with the Potawatomi. Argall used a combination of military pressure and promises of trade partnership to convince the Potawatomi leader, Ecopassus, to help him take Pocahontas captive. She was brought aboard an English ship under the pretense of being shown around and was not released. Think about the irony of that moment. The English who had watched Powhatan use prisoners as leverage, diplomatic tools, symbols of power, had finally turned the same tactic back on him. They had acquired the most valuable hostage on the continent. Powhatan received the news and went quiet. He paid some of the English demands, stalled on others, and did not attempt a military rescue. For a year, he simply watched and waited. And his daughter became, in that year, something Powhatan could not have anticipated. She converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, and genuinely appears to have made peace with her circumstances, or at least that is what the English records suggest. The full truth of her inner life in those months is something history cannot fully recover. What happened next is one of those moments where personal choices and geopolitical forces collide in a way that determines the fate of entire civilizations. In April of 1614, Dale Argall and 150 English soldiers paddled deep into Powhatan territory with Pocahontas on board. They pressed into the domain of Opechancanough, Powhatan's most formidable military commander, to the confluence of the York and Mattapony rivers, which is modern-day West Point in Virginia. Hundreds of Powhatan warriors assembled on the bank. For 2 full days, neither side fired. The English offered terms. Powhatan stalled. His daughter walked ashore to speak with her own people. She reportedly told them she was choosing to stay with the English, that the English were now her family. Whether those words reflected genuine feeling or diplomatic calculation, or some combination of both, no one on either bank that day could have said with certainty. But Powhatan accepted the decision, and with it, the war effectively ended. The peace was cemented in April of 1614, when Pocahontas informed her father she intended to marry John Rolfe, one of the Sea Venture survivors, a tobacco planter who had introduced a far more marketable strain of the crop to the Virginia colony. Powhatan consented. The marriage took place. The English and the Powhatan Confederacy agreed to a truce, and for a time, that truce held. It is worth pausing on what this outcome actually meant for both sides, because the history books tend to present it as a resolution. It was not a resolution. It was a pause. The English used the peace years to expand at a pace they could never have sustained during active conflict. Rolfe's tobacco transformed the Virginia economy. Plantations crept up and down the James. New settlements pushed into territory the Powhatan had considered their own. Pocahontas traveled to England in 1617, was presented at court, and perished of illness before she could return home. Her father, Powhatan, perished the following year. The peace he had made survived him only by a few seasons. His successor as paramount chief was not named immediately, but the man who effectively filled that role, the man who had led Powhatan warriors through the darkest years of the war, the man who had driven off the English at the Falls and organized the strike that wiped out the Jamestown blockhouse garrison, was watching. Pocahontas had not forgotten anything, and he was calculating the English expansion with the same patient, precise intelligence that had defined Powhatan himself. On March 22, 1622, he struck, without warning, simultaneously, across dozens of English settlements scattered along the James. It was the opening act of the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, and it would shake the English colonial enterprise to its foundation. But that is a story for another episode. The First Anglo-Powhatan War lasted from 1609 to 1614. What it produced was not peace, but a precedent. The English learned in Virginia what they had been practicing in Ireland, that colonial control could be achieved through starvation, through destruction of food supplies and villages, through the deliberate and systematic removal of entire peoples from their land. The Powhatan Confederacy, for its part, had come within a season of ending English settlement in North America permanently. The starving time was not propaganda. Jamestown nearly died. And if the Sea Venture had sunk rather than wrecked, if Governor De La Warr had not been sailing upriver at precisely the right moment, the entire course of North American history pivots on that single meeting of ships. The peace that followed was real for a few years. It was also built on a fundamental misunderstanding. The English saw Pocahontas's conversion and Powhatan's acceptance of the marriage as a sign that the Confederacy was ready to embrace English civilization. They believed the transformation had begun. Pocahontas, standing on the banks of the York River as those negotiations concluded, watching the English soldiers load back onto their boats, may have understood the situation very differently. What do you think was going through his mind in that moment? Was it patience or something darker? Drop your answer in the comments.